Well, I'd like to welcome you all to the last installment of has been dubbed our Plant Manager series, and again, what we were hoping is that we could get a lot of the management folks that didn't have a lot of background in the ISO program to sit through a few of these webinars and get a little bit better awareness of the requirements and make the audits that you guys will go through a little bit easier to get through. This particular presentation, we're going to focus on elements, basically 9.0 and 10.0 for EMS performance evaluation and EMS improvement. And the good news is, since the last or the previous installment of this presentation, we've had a chance to go through a number of different upgrade audits, and we're starting to get a little bit better flavor for how some of these registration auditors are going to interpret some of these requirements. So hopefully we can give you some pearls of wisdom and get you ready for your upgrade audit. And yeah. So this time, I promise, I will see your questions, and the challenge will be the same. I really need to hear some questions from you guys. Because it gets a little bit lonely, sitting here by myself. So please do chime in with questions in the chat box. Okay, we'll skip that. Yeah, just real quick, a little bit about ourselves here. Basically, our services are ISO and EHS compliance related. This year has been very, very busy helping clients with either pieces of the upgrade process or fully upgrading their documentation for them. A number of clients have wanted us to come in and just update their aspects process from the life cycle perspective, and we've been able to help with that. We've put together a new manual based on the new requirements, so if you want to upgrade your documentation there, we can help you with that. The other thing we've done is integrate our compliance assessments and internal audits so that we can in one audit satisfy the internal audit process and your requirement to periodically evaluate your compliance obligations. And the new one is called the SNAP assessment. That's pretty spiffy title there. But that's a one-day audit where we come in and really focus on auditing the new processes and engaging your management team so that they're fully ready to fulfill their new requirements under the standard. So that one's been a big seller. Just a one day we come in, look at just the new requirements, key managers, and really give a good assessment or maybe even a pre-audit of your upgrade audit. So if you guys are interested in any of that, please think of me. Again, a number of the key changes we've already gone through in previous webinars. This particular webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about performance evaluation and continual improvement and overall management engagement in those processes. So as we've said before, Plan, Do, Check, Act, that this is the entire standard. We're going to focus specifically on the checking process under performance evaluation and the acting process under 10.0 improvement. And again, the whole program here is designed to drive improvement in environmental performance. And as we described before, there's two closely knit concepts here. One is environmental performance, and they define environmental performance as performance relative to our aspects. So how much electricity do I use? How much wastewater do I discharge? What are my air emissions? Those are performance measures. Effectiveness is how often we do what we say we're going to do. How effective is my training process? How effectively am I meeting my compliance obligations? And that's another type of measurement as well. So your auditors are going to look for both your performance processes and your effectiveness monitoring processes. Just did a very nice audit for a site up in Boyne City, and their whole new quality program, every process has a performance measure, has an effectiveness measure. And if we can just get our environmental programs along those lines, I think that would be a big improvement. The new standard, again, is based on the new Annex SL format. So you'll see the ISO 9001, IATF 16949. I'm getting that one down. ISO 14000, and next year the ISO 45001 standards will all have these same 10 sections, and the overall goal is integration of the core processes. And we're starting to see a lot of clients really want to integrate quality and environmental into one process, and that's the direction they're driving us. But I still do have probably more often than not customers that are still quasi-separate systems, and we can talk more about that. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the first element, section 9, performance evaluation. 9.1 talks about monitoring and measurement, analysis and evaluation. 9.2, internal audit, and 9.3, management review. So here we find we have the words from the standard. The first thing, it says the organization shall monitor, measure, analyze, and evaluate its environmental performance. And again, remember, when you hear the word performance, this is performance relative to our aspects. Now the old 4.5.1 monitoring and measurement said we had to monitor and measure the key characteristics of our significant aspects. Now I don't see that here. I don't see that specificity. It just says we're going to monitor and measure our environmental performance. Now, does that mean are the environmental performance of our significant aspects? I could allude to that, but I don't see the words. So really, it is up to the organization, and organizations really need to understand this, because when your registration auditor says, "Well, geez, why don't you have an indicator for this?" You can say, "Well, we decided that wasn't a measure of our environmental performance. We still might think it's significant because we have a compliance obligation or a permit or some other issue, but we don't consider it a performance measure." Again, the organization shall determine. That's you guys. That's not your registration auditor. They may suggest things. They may think, "Well, geez, you should be measuring this," but that's just their opinion, their opportunity for improvement. And I'm really encouraging clients to push back, because when the organization shall and you do, you conform. And it's that simple. So the organization shall determine what needs to be monitored and measured, the methods to ensure valid results. I guess that's better than invalid results. The criteria against which the organization will evaluate its environmental performance. So for every performance measure, we have to have an indicator. Okay, now the indicator does not have to target improvement. It's just, this is what we're striving for. Red or green, good or bad. Very easy to do for safety, for quality, and you know, the criteria might be just plus or minus 5% of what we used last year. Wakes going to landfill, plus or minus 5% of what we sent to landfill last year. It doesn't have to be a specific number. It has to be a criteria to assess performance. Did we achieve it? Did we not? Good or bad? Yes or no? When we shall monitor and measure, and when the results of the monitoring and measurement shall be analyzed and evaluated. So this leaves a lot up to the organization. But where we're seeing a lot of focus from the registration folks is item C, and that's connecting some performance criteria to every measurable you have. Okay, and take a look at things like, you know, cardboard. Okay, I go to a company, they're charting and measuring their cardboard. Well, My question is your goal really to recycle more cardboard? And if you're running short of your goal, are you going to ask more vendors to send you stuff in cardboard so you can achieve your cardboard goal? And the obvious answer to that is, well, no, we're not going to do that. Our real goal is to make sure that every piece of cardboard that comes into our facility goes out to recycling and not to the landfill. The question becomes then, how do you measure that? That's the performance measure. It's not the total volume of cardboard. Ultimately, your goal might be to recycle less cardboard, to bring in less cardboard to the facility. So that's really challenging companies to come up with better performance measures. I think we might have been a little bit lazy before. Let's measure the total cardboard, the total plastic, the number of bulbs we send, and call that performance. It's not really performance. So as we go through this process with a number of clients, some things we're deciding to say, well, this is not a performance measure. We used to measure it because we had to, because we called it significant. So instead of having 8 things that we measure, these are the 4 things that we consider performance criteria. Now, I do believe your registration companies will push you to be doing some form of measuring for any aspect that you call significant. But again, I don't see the words here. And what I've always told people in the past is, if you have a significant aspect that's difficult to measure, it might not really be significant. And then we start to question, instead of having 15 significant aspects, why we don't only have maybe 6, 7, or 8 of them. Okay, monitoring and measurement matrix. What is that? Let me see if I have one of those available. Yeah. So here's an example of a monitoring and measuring matrix, and we put together different versions of this, but again, it really speaks to the standard and the basic requirements. What is it that we're going to monitor and measure? Who's responsible? What's the monitoring parameter? The frequency, the method, and what is our indicator? For each measurable, document that information. Is this required? No, it's not. Is it a good idea? I think so, because it reminds us what we do to monitor and measure and meet the requirement, and it's a very nice document to give to an external auditor, and really clearly presents the information, and then it's something we can easily present to management during the management review process. Okay. Any questions so far? So this is stuff we've really had to do for some time now, but I do believe there's a lot of room for improvement relative to how we characterize and measure performance. The organization shall ensure that calibrated and verified equipment is used. That's nothing new. The organization shall evaluate its performance and the effectiveness of the environmental management system. So this is where a lot of environmental systems are very weak. The one core process that we have to validate effectiveness would be our internal audit process, so you can kind of rest on that. But if you go into your quality programs, they'll have measures like on-time corrective actions, percent training complete, percent work orders done on time, those types of measures. And a number of those, if you've integrated environmental into them, would be environmental measures of effectiveness. But during your registration audit, be prepared to answer, how do you validate the effectiveness of your environmental system? Well, at its very root, we can say, well, during our internal audit process, we validate the effectiveness of our program. Through the management review process, we're validating the effectiveness of our program. But I would encourage you to take a look at your quality system and ask them the question, what are you measuring for effectiveness, and borrowing some of those things to use in the environmental process as well. This is turning into a very big deal during the upgrade audits, because everyone kind of gets performance, but the effectiveness piece is still a little bit lacking on the environmental side. Now, any questions on, or maybe things that you're already doing to validate effectiveness of your environmental system? Okay. The organization shall communicate relevant, and here's some buzzwords here, relevant environmental performance information internally and externally, as identified in their communications process. So go back to your communications procedure and identify the relevant performance information and how it's communicated internally and externally. If you recall, under the old standard, under the communications process 443, it said organizations had to determine whether to make information available about their significant aspects available to the public and record that decision. Most organizations just wrote in the procedure, we've decided not to communicate this information externally. So internally, it's easy. You know, performance information is communicated to management. If you're part of a larger organization, you may communicate that information to your corporate folks. Internally, you may post the performance information. Hopefully you post it right next to your quality and safety, environmental, right? But externally is a good question. So if we went to our communications procedure and said, we have determined that there is no relevant performance information that we want to communicate externally, does that meet this requirement? And my answer is, I think so. I think so. I think if you read the words, it said we will communicate only relevant performance information externally. And if we determine that there isn't anything relevant that we need to communicate, and we document that in our communications process, I think that's okay. Now, I'm sure I'm going to run across a number of external auditors that are going to say, no way. But then there's some additional words, as required by the compliance obligation. So obviously, if we are reporting our Tier 2 information, if our site has to report TRI information, if we're a Michigan Clean Corporate Citizens and we report certain measurables, those would all be things that we're already reporting externally. And obviously, those would be relevant. If the ISO people had their way, they would have us reporting all of our EMS performance measurables to the public. This is an international standard. They can't have their way. So they're kind of nudging organizations in that process. So what I'm typically suggesting to clients is, if they are already doing Tier 2 and TRI reporting, reference that. If they're clean corporate citizens, reference that information. If they're reporting information to corporate that's used as part of a sustainability program, reference that. And then just state that all other external communications on performance will be handled on a case-by-case basis or some similar information. But again, this is a very big point during the external registration process. And we shall maintain documented information. So we should have evidence. We're monitoring and measuring things. We're calibrating the required equipment. We have measures of performance and effectiveness, and internal and external communications. Should see some records. So again, just some examples of performance criteria versus effectiveness criteria. And we should, the standard says we're going to do both, performance measuring, effectiveness measuring. And we should see ample information that's being completed. And I think this says the same thing. So examples of performance, examples of effectiveness. And there is another version of a performance monitoring and measurement matrix. Now, because this is a redo and you guys are here for the first time, if you send me an email after this presentation, I'll actually send you this template if you're interested in it. So just when you get done, send me an email and I will I'll send you an actual Word document of this that's editable. And that's actually a word. Okay. 9.1.2, evaluation of compliance. And the good news is my current new friend, Alan Vandenberg, hello Alan, sent me an email this weekend asking me about this clause and really forced me to look at, what you would present as far as evidence relative to this requirement. So the first thing is it says the organization shall implement a process. So we must define a process to meet these requirements. The process needs to define A, the frequency at which we will evaluate compliance, B, how we will evaluate compliance and take actions where needed, and C, maintain knowledge and understanding of our compliance status. Okay, so again, we're going to write a procedure, we're going to have a flow chart, we're going to have a process that explains how we do this. So in 6.1.3, we've identified all of our compliance obligations. These would be compliance obligations to any interested party that we are required to give information to. And again, primarily we've been dealing with our legal regulations, our customer requirements, our corporate requirements, those types of things. And we don't have to evaluate compliance with every requirement the same way or at the same frequency. So to satisfy A, determine the frequency that compliance will be evaluated, we might specify legal requirements will be evaluated every 3 years, customer requirements will be evaluated during the PPAP process and the internal audit of our quality system, and other requirements may be evaluated at least every 3 years. So the frequency piece doesn't have to be the same for every type of information. But let's go back to our standard small site. Got some cardboard, some used oil, those mangly old universal waste light bulbs. And this type of a site might do an audit about once every 3 years, and they're going to look at all their legal and they need to look at the other requirements as well. Evaluation of compliance, B. Who's going to be responsible to evaluate compliance? What is their competency? And how will the compliance evaluation be documented? That should be defined within your process. And again, the big thing here is competency of those doing the evaluations. We can't ask our maintenance manager to evaluate compliance to the regulations. We can't hand them a checklist from the Michigan Manufacturer's Guide and say, fill this out and call it a compliance evaluation. He's not competent based on his training, education, and experience. Okay, it must be very clear that whoever does it, whether it's an on-site person, a corporate or division level person, an outside consultant, the competency of that person is really critical, and should be defined under B. And then C. Now C is the tricky one. How do we maintain knowledge and understanding of our compliance status? I think that's the $10,000 question here. And this is the one that Alan challenged me on. How do we prove this? How do we document it? Well, if we're doing an evaluation of compliance full blown every 3 years, we pay our sharp dressed consultant to come in. Sundays not sharp dressed. He evaluates our compliance, and then he goes away for 3 years. How do we maintain an understanding of our compliance status? Well, this can take any number of processes, but I think it's got to be defined. So one thing you could do is take that report that was done last year, and for the next 2 years, review that report and its findings and validate that these things that we have fixed are in compliance. You also may have routine inspections you do. Maybe you do a safety inspection to check on emergency response, container labeling. Maybe we do SPCC inspections to validate our spill kits. Again, those inspections are ways that we maintain knowledge of our compliance status. We may get updates from our corporate office on new regulations coming out, newsletters you may get from consultants. You may subscribe to a service, JJ Keller, one of these other ones that tells you about changing regulations. And when there are changes, this should be presented through the management review process. And that again is a way to maintain knowledge of our compliance status. Our 5S audits. Anything that we're doing, hopefully we're doing periodic checks on our universal waste, the batteries and bulbs. Those would all be different ways that you are maintaining knowledge of your compliance status. So I think the first step is going to be to understand what those are for your site, define those within your evaluation process, and then just implement those. And we should see documented information as evidence of the compliance evaluations. One of the tools that we've used with a number of clients is this compliance calendar tool. You have an Excel spreadsheet, a bunch of activities, the months that it's done in. We do quarterly stormwater inspections. We do bi-weekly routine inspections. We do a monthly fire extinguisher inspection. All these things are put on a compliance calendar. Then at the end of the year, we could go through that calendar, validate that everything's been done, sign and date it, put it in the folder. That's another mechanism to maintain knowledge of your compliance status. And this is one of the areas, again, where you should expect to see a lot of attention during your upgrade audit. Any questions on that? Okay. Now I'm going to start yelling about questions. Last time I moved the thing and I couldn't see all your questions. So the challenge here is the first one I ask a question, I send something free. I don't know what I'll send free, but I'm sure it'll be good. And then I can't even bribe a question. Okay. Okay. Internal audits. Again, I don't perceive any new requirements. But I do want to undo some bad internal auditor training. I think there's a lot of people that train people to do internal audits that talk about auditing to the standard. And the goal of the internal audit is to validate that we've implemented our planned arrangements, our requirements, to validate that we've implemented our procedures. And if you look at the standard, that's the first thing it tells us to do. Check on the organization's own requirements. We still get to sites where you say, show me your internal audit. They whip out a checklist, just formatted just like the standard. Does the company have an environmental policy? Check. Does the policy contain the 3 commitments to blah, blah, check. And then I say, what does a check mark mean? Well, everything's good. And they haven't had a finding in their internal audits for years, you know. That's not what the internal audit's about. It's dusting off your procedures, your significant aspects, your compliance obligations, walking the floor and validating that they are being implemented properly. Obviously, we need to meet the requirements of the standard. That's a no-brainer. We still see a little bit of issue with objectivity. You know, people trying, you know, we train 12 auditors, they're all gone. The management reps auditing their own work. That's still not going to fly. We should see an audit program set up. So it says we're going to audit our system, not every year, not every requirement every year, but at planned intervals. So planned interval says we have a schedule. This is how we plan. We do layered process audits for our quality program. We check on cardboard recycling in the process and container labeling. We do 5S audits, and we check on our spill kits. We do a system audit every year. Then we check on all our EMS system stuff. That starts to feel like an audit program. And we need to see good evidence of the audits. I still get to a lot of sites where we look at, you know, internal audits, and the audit documentation is very scant. We see check marks. We don't see a lot of notes. It's really hard to understand what it was the internal auditor actually assessed to prove conformance. So please ask your auditors to document conformance as well as nonconformance. Okay. Any questions on internal audit? Well, I'm guessing you guys can still hear me. So we will continue. Management review, again, I like the fact that it's more specific. And you know, the inputs and outputs have been defined better for us. It's put in the kind of the checking part of the process, but we still need to see action from management. So any management review that doesn't have action items come out of it, really question how effective that management review process is. So in the new standard, there's some very specific inputs that need to be discussed. I would encourage you to format your management review notes to follow this. And that's what I'll do. The first person that asks a question, I'll send you my template for management review under this element. So there's your incentive. Okay, so we need to see the status of action items from the previous management review. So that meant that the last meeting we had action items. Changes in our context, interested parties, significant aspects, risk, and opportunities. Again, these things may not change, but you need to see some evidence that they were discussed. The extent to which we've met the objectives. So we set objectives last year. Did we achieve them? It should be very simple discussion. We set the objective to reduce electrical usage, and we achieved it or we didn't achieve it. Information on our environmental performance. So nonconformities and corrective action. And notice it doesn't just say status of corrective actions. So what were the nonconformances and what were the corrective actions based on those? So not just we have 5 nonconformances and 2 are open, but we had 5 nonconformances. Here's what they were. Here's how they've been corrected. Our monitoring and measurement results, which is performance, fulfillment of our compliance obligations, permits, etc., and our audit results. So again, I think a very much expanded input here and requires much more specific information. Adequacy of resources. So 7.1 says management shall ensure we have adequate resources. Here it says we have to have a discussion with management. Do we currently have adequate resources? And Mary says, will this presentation be available at another date? I don't know. I do think I may end up ultimately posting a recorded version of this if you're interested. F, relevant communications from interested parties. That's old news. Opportunities for continual improvement. Had to do that before. And then we have very specific outputs. So the old standard just said we will have outputs. So the new standard says we will have outputs that will include a conclusion regarding the effectiveness of the EMS, decisions related to continual improvement. If we've recommended 4 action items for improvement, have they been approved? Have they been tabled? Actions relative to the need for changes, including any additional resources. Actions if needed when objectives were not achieved. So if we set an objective last year and we didn't achieve it, what's going to be the action based on not achieving the objective? Opportunities to improve integration. So under 5.1 leadership, we had to have systems that were integrated. And in management review, we have to talk about additional areas of integration. So we could see that currently we have our corrective action process and document control integrated. We have opportunities to integrate, management review, controller records, and corrective action tracking. And then just discussions on what those opportunities are. And then any implications for the strategic direction of the organization. Again, there may not be a lot to discuss there, but some of the cost savings relative to the environmental program, new permits that could be needed, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so some action items. Again, we have to have very clear definitions of our performance measures and effectiveness measures. You may wish to develop a monitoring and measurement matrix, which we've highlighted here. And if you want a copy of that, please do send me an email. Define the process to communicate performance information internally and externally, what that's going to be. Define the process for monitoring compliance and how are we maintaining our knowledge of our compliance status. Look at, a good place for integration is internal audit, so please look at that and develop a new agenda and template for your management review to make sure you've captured all the required inputs and outputs. Okay. Any questions on performance evaluation? Okay, so let's go right into 10.0, improvement. Says we're going to improve. The thing that I like about this element is that they put corrective action into the improvement phase, which tells me that nonconformances are a good thing. Nonconformances drive improvement. So if we go through a bunch of registration with audits with no nonconformities, a bunch of internal audits with no findings, it doesn't give us what we need to drive improvement, both to our system and to our performance. So again, some cultures, they feel like, well, if you have a nonconformance, the world ends. Well, it doesn't end unless it's a major nonconformance. But again, it just shows us that defining nonconformities can be a positive thing. Okay, so 10.1, general improvement. And it doesn't get any more general than this. The organization shall determine opportunities for improvement and implement necessary actions to achieve intended outcomes. So if you remember from our previous webinars, the minimum intended outcomes of your management system are to enhance environmental performance, meet our compliance obligations, and achieve our environmental objectives. So we are going to determine opportunities to improve, to help with those things, and we are going to implement those actions. So if we see evidence that opportunities have been identified, the needed actions have been defined, and they have been implemented, I believe we've met this requirement. Pretty darn general. I'm going to skip over corrective action for a second and go right into 10.3 because these words seem very similar to me. We then have continual improvement, which again, if you remember the definition of performance, that deals with our aspects. So the organization shall improve the effectiveness of their EMS to enhance environmental performance. Now, this is one that I'm a little bit interested to see how it gets interpreted. So if I have 4 measurables and none of them improves, is that a nonconformance to this requirement? My instinct, I want to say no. I want to say if we've seen improvements in effectiveness of the system, if we've seen the organization identify planned actions and implement those, if we've seen them track and monitor performance, but they haven't improved, I think that's the intent. But I'm kind of worried about how some other auditors or registration auditors might interpret this. Do we have to improve? And if any of you have any thoughts on that, please chat in, because right now the registration auditors, consultants, and you guys, we're all going through this transition process where we're really trying to understanding what's a requirement and what isn't. So again, when I read the words, it almost feels like if we don't enhance performance, we could potentially not conform to this requirement. But I'm not quite willing to go that far yet. Nonconformance and corrective action, not really a lot of change here, but again, we're starting to see some fallout from some of the sites that we've worked with. The first step is to react to nonconformances. That's the correction. We see the drum of used oil not labeled, we labeled it. We're going to deal with the issue. Then we're going to evaluate the cause, or the buzzword is the root cause, for why the nonconformance has occurred, determining the cause, and this is one where we're seeing some activity, determining if a similar nonconformance occurs in other areas of the organization. So those of you that are on a multi-site certificate, if you see one nonconformance at one site, you need to look at the other sites to determine, does that nonconformance occur? If you're on a single site certificate, you then need to take a look at, does this nonconformance exist in other areas of the plant? So container labeling, spill kits not being stocked, recycling done inappropriately, would be things that if you see it in one area, you'll need to have some evidence that you've looked in other areas for similar nonconformances. And we've had one external auditor suggest that that should be added to the corrective action form as well. We're going to implement the change and review the effectiveness. And this continues to be a weakness in a number of sites, is after you've made the corrective action, how do you validate effectiveness? The best way to do that would be during the next internal audit, have some evidence that the previous corrective actions have been reviewed. Some sites will do a 30, 60, 90-day review. But again, this continues to be problematic at probably 25% of the sites that I get to, is how effectiveness is actually validated and documented. And again, big suggestion here, integrate this with quality. There's no reason that an environmental corrective action should be done any different than a quality corrective action. If you got one form, there's no reason to have two forms. This is one of the very easiest areas to integrate and demonstrate some level of integration. So please do work with your quality friends to come up with that form. And again, I like this picture because it's got a lot of pretty colors, but it shows that our environmental program, very similar to our quality program, but it's different. Because with quality, we start with our stakeholder requirements and stakeholder satisfaction, which is our owners and our customers. With an environmental program, we have a lot more stakeholders that we're trying to satisfy. Our regulators, our employees, our neighbors, or our communities, the owners of our organization, the government, non-government organizations are all stakeholders that we have to try to keep satisfied through the various processes. Now Alan's question is, are there any less requirements for smaller companies? Well, the easy answer is no. You have to meet the same requirements as a larger organization. But if you go back to, now you're testing my memory here, 7.51 documentation, it readily acknowledges that the documentation requirements for a small organization may be significantly less than that for a larger organization. So the core requirements don't change, but the amount of documentation to support conformance can and will change for smaller organizations. You just have to be a little bit more inventive in how you can streamline some of the requirements and processes and get it so that fewer resources are needed to maintain the requirements. And we can definitely help you with that. Okay, this is no longer appropriate. These are done. That's us. Okay, well, that's it for the webinar today. It's a little shorter. I do appreciate the questions coming in. When you get to the establishing your performance measurement criteria, if you have any questions, please give me an email. I love to answer emails. As Alan can attest to, I do answer them, and they were, and I hate the free word, but it was a free answer. But I do love to help people figure out how to streamline some of these requirements. If you do want a copy of the monitoring and measurement matrix, shoot me an email. If you do want to see previous copies or previous versions of our webinars, they're on YouTube, and I'll probably post this one as well. And if you guys get into any problems updating your documentation, you want a quick internal audit done, you want somebody to come in just for a day to meet with your management team and explain the new changes to them, please think of us, and we'd love to help you out. And with that, I think if I click, there's us, and the next one says questions. So thank you for your time on a late Monday, and if you have any more questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, needs, please